The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of courtroom 304, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. Dr. Maya Thompson shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to ignore the disapproving glances directed at her weather-worn research clothes. Her salt-stained boots and field pants stood in stark contrast to the formal attire worn by others in the traffic court. The clock on the wall showed 9:45 a.m. Maya had been standing for nearly an hour, waiting for her case to be called. Her mind kept drifting back to the valuable coral samples sitting in her research vehicle's specially designed storage unit. Even now, she worried about their condition, knowing every minute counted in preserving their viability for her groundbreaking study. Case number 247, the court clerk announced, her voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Dr. Maya Thompson, parking violation in a restricted zone on Ocean Drive. Maya stepped forward, her footsteps echoing in the sudden silence. Judge Richard Barrett looked down from his elevated bench, his steel-gray eyes scanning her appearance with barely concealed judgment. At 65, he had served on this bench for over 2 decades, developing a reputation for being strictly by the book. "Your Honor," Maya began, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I can explain the circumstances of—" "Miss Thompson," Judge Barrett interrupted, emphasizing the Ms. despite the clerk clearly stating her title. "The citation clearly states you parked your vehicle in a clearly marked restricted area for over 30 minutes. Do you deny this?" Maya took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. "No, Your Honor, but there were extenuating circumstances. You see, I'm a marine biologist, and there was a sudden storm approaching." "A storm?" Judge Barrett's eyebrows rose skeptically. "Miss Thompson, this court sees dozens of creative excuses every day. The weather is hardly a justification for breaking clearly posted parking restrictions." The young marine biologist felt her face grow warm, but she persisted. "Your Honor, I had time-sensitive research materials in my vehicle. The samples I was transporting are part of a crucial study on endangered coral species. The storm's electrical activity could have compromised." "Miss Thompson," the judge cut her off again, his tone growing more stern. "This is a traffic court, not a science symposium. The law applies equally to everyone, regardless of their claimed profession." A few snickers echoed from the gallery behind her. Maya's hands clenched at her sides, her knuckles turning white. She was used to being underestimated, but this dismissive treatment stung particularly sharp. "I have here," Judge Barrett continued, shuffling through the papers before him, "a citation for parking in a restricted zone during peak hours. The fine is typically $150, but given your apparent lack of respect for the court's time with these elaborate excuses, I'm adding a $50 surcharge." Maya's eyes widened. The fine wasn't the issue. Her research grant could cover it. But the injustice of not being heard, of being dismissed without consideration, made her stomach knot. "Your Honor, please," she tried one last time. "If you just let me show you my identification and research credentials." "That will be all, Miss Thompson," Judge Barrett declared firmly, already reaching for his gavel. "Pay the fine at the clerk's office. Next case." The bang of the gavel echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Maya stood frozen for a moment, feeling the weight of the judge's prejudice and her own frustration. As she turned to leave, she caught sight of her reflection in the courtroom's wooden panels, her dark skin contrasting with the white walls, her professional confidence momentarily shaken by this reminder of persistent biases. Little did Judge Barrett know that the woman he had just dismissed so readily was featured on the cover of this month's National Geographic, her groundbreaking research revolutionizing marine conservation efforts across the globe. But for now, Maya simply straightened her shoulders and walked toward the clerk's office, her mind already returning to her endangered coral samples and the important work that awaited her, regardless of this morning's injustice. Judge Richard Barrett watched as Maya Thompson made her way toward the clerk's office. Something about her composure, even in defeat, bothered him. Most people who appeared before him either showed anger or fear, but this woman carried herself with an underlying confidence that seemed out of place for someone in her position. He called for the next case, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the previous one. The way she had mentioned research materials and coral samples, it seemed too detailed to be a simple excuse. Still, he had seen every trick in the book during his 20 years on the bench. People always had stories, always had reasons why the rules shouldn't apply to them. In the clerk's office, Maya stood in line, her phone buzzing constantly. Her research assistant, Tom, had sent multiple messages about the coral sample's temperature readings. The specialized cooling unit in her vehicle was maintaining the perfect temperature, but they needed to get the samples to the lab within the next hour for the best results. "The fine will be $200, the clerk said when Maya reached the counter. The young woman behind the desk looked at Maya with more curiosity than judgment. "You said something about being a marine biologist." Maya nodded, pulling out her wallet. "Yes, I work with the Ocean Conservation Institute. We're studying the effects of climate change on endangered coral species." She paused, then added quietly, "Not that it matters here." The clerk, whose nameplate reads Sarah Chen, tilted her head. "Actually, it might. We have special provisions for research vehicles during emergencies. Did you have your research vehicle permit displayed?" Maya's eyes widened. I didn't know about any permit. I've only been in this city for 3 months, setting up our new research station." Sarah began typing rapidly on her computer. The judge should have asked about that. It's part of our standard procedure for any vehicle-related citations. Back in the courtroom, Judge Barrett was having trouble focusing on the case before him. Something about the previous case kept nagging at him. The woman's mention of time-sensitive samples, the professional way she carried herself despite her casual appearance. It didn't fit the profile of someone making up excuses. His thoughts were interrupted when Sarah, the clerk, approached his bench with a concerned expression. She handed him a printout of the city's parking ordinances, with one section highlighted. Section 23.4. Research vehicles with proper permits are exempt from standard parking restrictions during verifiable emergencies involving scientific materials or equipment. The judge frowned. He should have asked about this. It was his job to consider all relevant regulations, not just the ones he assumed applied based on. Based on what? His first impression of a woman in field clothes. Meanwhile, Maya stood outside the courthouse, making urgent calls to her team. The fine had taken a chunk out of their petty cash fund, but the samples were her primary concern. She had spent months tracking this particular species of coral, which showed promising signs of adaptation to warming waters. Understanding its resilience could be key to protecting other coral species from climate change. "Dr. Thompson," Sarah's voice called out from the courthouse entrance. "Please wait." Maya turned, surprised to see both the clerk and Judge Barrett hurrying down the steps toward her. The judge's face had lost its stern mask, replaced by something that looked almost like concern. "Ms. Dr. Thompson," Judge Barrett corrected himself, his voice carrying a note of humility that hadn't been there before. "It has been brought to my attention that I failed to follow proper procedure in your case. I should have inquired about your research vehicle status." Maya stood straighter, her professional dignity returning. "Yes, Your Honor, you should have. Those samples in my vehicle are part of a critical study that could help save endangered marine ecosystems. When the storm approached, I had to secure them immediately. Time and temperature are crucial factors in our research." The judge nodded slowly, the weight of his hasty judgment becoming clear. But before he could respond, a commotion near the courthouse entrance caught everyone's attention. A young man was rushing toward them, waving something in his hand, the latest issue of National Geographic magazine. The young man running toward them was Kevin Santos, a junior clerk who spent most of his lunch breaks reading science magazines. His face was flushed with excitement as he reached the small group gathered at the courthouse steps, the latest issue of National Geographic clutched tightly in his hands. "Judge Barrett," Kevin called out, slightly out of breath. "You need to see this." He held up the magazine, its glossy cover catching the morning sunlight. There on the front page was an underwater photograph that made everyone gasp. The image showed a diver surrounded by vibrant coral reefs, their colors almost glowing in the crystal-clear water. The diver's face was clearly visible through the mask. It was Dr. Maya Thompson. The headline read, "The Coral Whisperer. Dr. Maya Thompson's Race to Save Our Ocean's Living Rainbow." Sarah, the court clerk, was the first to break the stunned silence. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, looking back and forth between the magazine and Maya. "That's really you." Judge Barrett took the magazine with slightly trembling hands. He opened it to the main article, where more photos showed Dr. Thompson working in various underwater locations around the world. The article's first paragraph jumped out at him. At just 32, Dr. Maya Thompson has become one of the world's leading experts in coral conservation. Her groundbreaking research has identified several species of coral that could hold the key to saving marine ecosystems from the devastating effects of climate change. Maya stood quietly, watching as the judge's face changed while he read. The stern mask he had worn in the courtroom had completely disappeared, replaced by a look of growing embarrassment and realization. The samples in my vehicle, Maya explained gently, are from a newly discovered coral species that shows remarkable resistance to warming waters. We've been tracking its growth patterns for months. When the storm approached, I had to protect them. Every sample could hold vital information for saving entire reef systems. Kevin, still catching his breath, eagerly jumped in. Dr. Thompson's work is amazing. She discovered a new species of coral last year that can survive in temperatures that would kill most other corals. She's been featured in scientific journals worldwide. A small crowd had begun to gather around them. Other people leaving the courthouse stopped to see what was happening, and several recognized Maya from the magazine cover. Phones came out as people whispered and pointed, some taking pictures of the renowned scientists standing on their local courthouse steps. Dr. Thompson, Judge Barrett said, his voice heavy with regret, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions, incorrect assumptions, that led me to dismiss your explanation without proper consideration. Maya looked at the judge thoughtfully. The morning sun had risen higher, and its warm light seemed to soften the earlier tension between them. Your Honor, she replied, assumptions can be dangerous things. In my work, if I assumed I knew everything about a coral species just by looking at it, I might miss a groundbreaking discovery. Sometimes the most remarkable findings come from looking deeper than the surface. The judge nodded slowly, understanding the gentle lesson in her words. He looked down at the magazine again, at the image of this brilliant scientist working in her element, then back at the woman standing before him in her field clothes, the very outfit he had judged her for earlier. The coral samples, he said suddenly, remembering the urgency of her situation. How much time do you have? Maya checked her phone quickly. We need to get them to the lab within the next 40 minutes for optimal results. Kevin, Judge Barrett called to the young clerk, who straightened up immediately. Get Dr. Thompson's vehicle permit processed right now. Priority clearance. He turned back to Maya. And of course, the fine is dismissed. I should have listened to your explanation from the beginning. As Kevin rushed back into the courthouse to process the permit, Maya's phone buzzed again. Her research team was waiting, and the coral samples needed her attention. But something important had happened here on these courthouse steps, a moment of recognition that went far deeper than a magazine cover. The courthouse lobby had transformed into an impromptu gathering as word spread about the renowned scientist in their midst. Kevin, the young clerk, had returned with the vehicle permit and was now enthusiastically sharing highlights from the National Geographic article with anyone who would listen. Dr. Thompson's research team discovered 3 new species of coral last year alone, he explained to the growing crowd, but that's not even the most impressive part. She developed a new method for coral restoration that's being used in marine reserves worldwide. Maya stood somewhat uncomfortably in the center of attention, her mind still partly focused on the coral samples waiting in her vehicle. Judge Barrett noticed her glancing at her phone again and understood the urgency of her situation. Perhaps, he suggested, raising his voice slightly to be heard above the murmuring crowd, Dr. Thompson could tell us a bit about her current research while we walk to her vehicle. I'd like to personally ensure there are no more misunderstandings about her parking situations in the future. The small group, including Sarah and Kevin, moved with them toward the parking area. Maya began explaining her work, her voice growing animated as she spoke about her passion. The coral samples I'm transporting today are particularly exciting, she said, her earlier frustration forgotten in the enthusiasm of sharing her research. We found a species that's adapting to warmer waters in ways we'd never seen before. It's like watching evolution happen in real time. Judge Barrett listened intently, his earlier prejudices replaced by genuine interest. And this could help save other coral reefs, he asked. Exactly. Maya nodded, quickening her pace slightly. If we can understand how this species adapts, we might be able to help other coral species survive the changing ocean conditions. Every reef we save helps protect countless marine species and coastal communities. They reached her research vehicle, which looked like a regular van from the outside but was equipped with sophisticated scientific equipment. Maya opened the back doors to reveal the specialized storage unit maintaining the precise temperature for the coral samples. Sarah peered at the digital display showing the temperature readings. All this technology just to keep coral alive, she asked, fascinated. Coral is incredibly sensitive, Maya explained, checking the readings herself. Even small changes in temperature can affect their survival. These particular samples need to be kept at exactly 26.5 degrees Celsius. Judge Barrett shook his head in amazement. When you tried to tell me about this in court, I assumed you were just making excuses. I never imagined. That's often the problem, isn't it? Maya said gently. We make quick judgments based on appearances, without taking the time to understand the whole story. In my work, rushing to conclusions without proper observation can mean missing crucial discoveries. Kevin, who had been flipping through the magazine again, spoke up excitedly. Look at this part. It says Dr. Thompson's research has already helped save 3 endangered fish species that depend on coral reefs for survival. The judge took the magazine again, studying the photographs more carefully this time. There was one of Maya giving a TED talk about ocean conservation, another of her working with local fishermen in Southeast Asia to protect their reef systems, and a stunning underwater shot of her documenting a newly discovered coral species. Dr. Thompson, he said, his voice carrying the weight of genuine regret, I feel I must apologize again. Not just for dismissing your explanation, but for letting my preconceptions cloud my judgment. Maya checked her phone one last time. Her team was waiting at the lab. Your Honor, in science, we learn the most when we admit our mistakes and adjust our approach based on new information. That's how progress happens. A small smile crossed the judge's face. Indeed. And speaking of progress, you should get these samples to your lab, but perhaps you would be willing to come back sometime? Our local schools could benefit greatly from learning about your work. Maya's eyes lit up at the suggestion. What had started as a frustrating morning was transforming into an unexpected opportunity to share her passion for marine science with a new audience. After Dr. Thompson left for her laboratory, Judge Barrett returned to his chambers and closed the door. For the first time in his 20 years on the bench, he canceled the remaining cases for the morning. He needed time to think. Sitting at his desk, he stared at the National Geographic magazine that Kevin had let him keep. The image of Maya Thompson working underwater among the coral reefs seemed to stare back at him, challenging everything he thought he knew about making fair judgments. His secretary, Mrs. Martinez, knocked and entered with his usual mid-morning coffee. Is everything all right, Judge? It's not like you to cancel court sessions. Martha, he said slowly, how long have you worked with me? 15 years this October, she replied, setting down the coffee cup. And in all that time, have you ever seen me make assumptions about people based on their appearance? He looked up at her, genuinely seeking an answer. Mrs. Martinez hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Sir, we all have our biases. The important thing is recognizing them. The judge picked up the magazine again. This morning, I saw a woman in worn clothes and boots and immediately assumed she was making excuses. I didn't even give her the chance to properly explain her situation. And do you know what the worst part is? I didn't even follow proper court procedure because I was so quick to judge. He stood up and walked to the window overlooking the courthouse square. People were going about their daily business below, each with their own story, their own important work to do. When I started my career, he continued, I promised myself I would be fair and just. But today made me realize that being fair isn't just about following the law, it's about giving everyone a genuine chance to be heard. Mrs. Martinez watched as the usually stoic judge struggled with his thoughts. Perhaps this is an opportunity, she suggested, to make changes, not just for yourself but for the whole court. Judge Barrett turned back from the window. You know, Dr. Thompson said something interesting. She said that in science, they learn the most when they admit their mistakes and adjust their approach. Maybe the legal system could learn from that. He sat back down at his desk and began writing in his legal pad. For the next hour, he reviewed his recent cases, thinking about other times he might have let his prejudices affect his judgments. The stack of notes grew as he remembered faces, circumstances, and quick decisions he'd made. Around noon, Kevin knocked on his door with some court documents that needed signing. The young clerk was still excited about the morning's events. Judge Barrett, Kevin said, placing the papers on the desk, you should see social media right now. People are sharing pictures of Dr. Thompson at the courthouse, and she just posted about how a challenging morning turned into an opportunity for understanding. The judge looked up, surprised. She posted about this? Yes, sir. She wrote about how important it is to look beyond first impressions and give people a chance to explain their stories. She didn't mention you by name, but she said the experience reminded her that change is possible when people are willing to learn from their mistakes. Judge Barrett felt a mix of embarrassment and gratitude. He could have been portrayed as the villain in this story, but instead, Dr. Thompson had chosen to focus on the positive outcome. He picked up his pen and began writing again, this time with a clearer purpose. At the top of the page, he wrote, "Proposed changes to court procedures, ensuring fair hearings for all." "Kevin," he called out as the clerk was leaving, "could you schedule a meeting with the other judges for tomorrow morning, and see if Dr. Thompson might be available next week to speak at our monthly staff meeting?" "Of course, sir," Kevin replied with a smile. "Should I mention it's about updating our procedures?" "Yes," the judge nodded, looking at the National Geographic cover once more. "It's about making sure we never let appearances prevent us from hearing the whole story." A week after the courthouse incident, Dr. Maya Thompson sat across from Judge Barrett in his office. The formal courtroom setting had been replaced by a more comfortable environment, with afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of fresh coffee in the air. "Thank you for coming back, Dr. Thompson," the judge said, gesturing to the spread of documents on his desk. "I've spent the past week reviewing our court procedures and thinking about how we can do better." Maya picked up her coffee cup, noting how different this interaction felt from their first meeting. "I appreciate the invitation, Your Honor. Though I must admit, I didn't expect this outcome when I got that parking ticket." "Please call me Richard," he said with a small smile. "I think we're past courtroom formalities." He paused, collecting his thoughts. "You know, I've been a judge for 2 decades, and I thought I had seen everything. But that day taught me I still have much to learn." Maya leaned forward, genuinely interested. "Tell me about what you've been thinking." "Well," he began, pulling out some papers, "I've been looking into creating new guidelines for hearing cases. Simple things, really, making sure we ask about professional credentials, understanding emergency situations better, being more thorough in our questioning." "Sometimes the simplest changes can have the biggest impact," Maya agreed. "In my research, we often find that small adjustments in how we approach a problem can lead to breakthrough discoveries." The judge nodded eagerly. "That's exactly what I wanted to discuss with you. Your work, the way you study coral reefs and look for solutions to save them, it reminded me of why I became a judge in the first place. To make a positive difference, to protect what's important." Maya smiled, seeing the genuine enthusiasm in his eyes. "You know, coral reefs teach us a lot about connection and community. Every piece matters, from the smallest polyp to the largest fish. When one part suffers, the whole system is affected. Just like our justice system," Judge Barrett said thoughtfully. "Every interaction, every decision we make, affects the whole community." She nodded, pulling out her phone to show him some photos. "Look at this," she said, displaying an image of a vibrant coral reef. "This reef was nearly dead 2 years ago, but by understanding its needs and making small changes to protect it, we helped it recover. Now it's thriving." The judge studied the before and after photos with interest. "And those samples you were transporting that day, how did they turn out?" Maya's face lit up. "Actually, they provided exactly the data we needed. The coral showed remarkable adaptation abilities. We're now working on applying these findings to help other reef systems." "I've been reading about your work," Judge Barrett admitted, pointing to a stack of science magazines on his desk. "It's fascinating how you've dedicated your life to saving these ecosystems. I realize now how short-sighted I was to dismiss your explanation that day." "Sometimes the best growth comes from uncomfortable moments," Maya replied. "That morning could have ended very differently. But here we are, having a conversation about making positive changes." The judge stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the city. "I've invited the other judges to meet with you next week, if you're willing. Your perspective on looking deeper, on not making snap judgments, could help us all become better at what we do." Maya joined him at the window. "I'd be happy to speak with them. You know, in science, We have a saying: observation without bias leads to discovery. Maybe in law, listening without prejudice leads to justice. Judge Barrett turned to face her. Dr. Thompson, Maya, thank you. Not just for coming back today, but for showing me that it's never too late to learn and change. That's the beauty of both science and justice, she replied warmly. There's always room for growth, always a chance to do better. Outside the window, the city continued its busy pace, unaware that in this quiet office, two people from very different worlds had found common ground in their desire to make things better. 1 month after the parking ticket incident, the city courthouse had undergone noticeable changes. The once stern atmosphere had softened, replaced by a more understanding environment where people felt heard. Judge Barrett had become the unexpected champion of these changes, starting with his own courtroom. On this particular morning, he sat at his bench, listening carefully to a young mechanic explain why he had parked his tow truck in a no-parking zone. Instead of making quick judgments, the judge asked thoughtful questions about the emergency repair situation the mechanic had faced. Your quick action prevented a dangerous situation, Judge Barrett concluded, dismissing the ticket. Thank you for putting public safety first. Sarah, who still worked as the court clerk, smiled as she watched. She remembered how different things had been just a few weeks ago when Dr. Thompson had stood in the same spot. The change in Judge Barrett was remarkable. During the lunch break, the judge headed to the courthouse conference room where a new program was taking shape. Dr. Thompson had helped create Justice Listens, an initiative teaching court officials how to better understand the communities they served. The key, Maya explained to the room full of judges and court officials, is to approach each case like a scientist approaches research, with an open mind and a willingness to look beyond the surface. Judge Barrett sat at the back of the room, watching his colleagues engage with Maya's presentation. On the walls hung photos of coral reefs alongside quotes about justice and understanding. It was his idea to blend these two worlds, showing how the patience needed to study nature could apply to the legal system. In the past month, Maya continued, this courthouse has processed 30% fewer appeals because cases are being heard more thoroughly the first time. People feel respected and understood, even when the judgment doesn't go their way. After the session, Judge Barrett met with Maya in the courthouse garden, a space that had recently been renovated to include educational panels about marine life and justice. It was their idea to create a place where people could learn while waiting for their court appointments. I never imagined a parking ticket would lead to all this, Maya said, watching as a group of school children read the panels about coral reefs and ocean conservation. Neither did I, the judge admitted. But sometimes the best changes come from unexpected moments. Speaking of change, how are those coral samples doing? Maya's face brightened. The research is going amazingly well. And you know what? The way this courthouse is transformed reminds me of how coral reefs can recover when given the right support. Both show that positive change is possible. Inside the courthouse, more changes were visible. New signs clearly explain parking regulations for emergency and research vehicles. The waiting area now had educational displays about different professions and the valid reasons they might need special consideration. Even the court officers had received training on approaching situations with more understanding. Kevin, the young clerk who had first recognized Maya from the magazine, had been put in charge of a new community outreach program. He organized regular visits from professionals in different fields to help court staff better understand the various situations they might encounter. Judge Barrett, Kevin called out, approaching the garden with some papers. The statistics from the first month are in. Complaints about unfair treatment are down by 40%, and public satisfaction with the court has increased significantly. The judge nodded, satisfied. And how are the special parking permits working out? Very well, Kevin replied. We've issued them to research teams, emergency responders, and other essential workers. It's making a real difference. Maya checked her phone, smiling at a notification. Speaking of making a difference, the article about this courthouse's transformation just went live on the National Geographic website. They're calling it From Judgment to Understanding: How a Parking Ticket Changed a Court System. Judge Barrett felt a mix of humility and pride. His moment of prejudice had led to something unexpected, a complete transformation of how justice was served in their community. As he watched more visitors enter the educational garden, You realize that sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments of realization. 6 months after the parking ticket incident, the city courthouse hosted a special event. The main hall was filled with students from local schools, their excited chatter echoing off the high ceilings. At the front of the room, a large screen showed underwater images of colorful coral reefs. Dr. Maya Thompson stood beside Judge Richard Barrett as they welcomed the students to the first Ocean Justice Day, a unique program that combined marine science education with lessons about fairness and understanding. "Who can tell me what coral reefs and justice have in common?" Maya asked the young audience. A small girl in the front row raised her hand. "They both need patience and care to grow," the student answered enthusiastically. Judge Barrett smiled, remembering how his own understanding had grown over the past months. The courthouse had become more than just a place of law. It was now a center for community learning and growth. The event was part of a larger initiative that had spread beyond their city. Other courthouses across the country had heard about their program and started implementing similar changes. The National Geographic had published a follow-up article titled "How One Court's Transformation is Changing Justice Systems Nationwide." During the presentation, Maya showed the students her latest research findings. The coral samples from that fateful morning had led to breakthrough discoveries in reef preservation. But more importantly, they had sparked a change that went far beyond marine science. Sometimes, Maya explained to the students, the biggest discoveries happen when we learn to look at things differently. Just like how we found that these coral species can adapt to change, we've learned that our justice system can adapt too. Judge Barrett stepped forward. "Before I met Dr. Thompson, I thought I knew everything about making fair decisions. But I learned that true justice requires us to look deeper, to understand people's stories, and to admit when we need to change." The students then broke into groups for interactive sessions. Some learned about marine ecosystems from Maya's research team, while others participated in mock court sessions where they practiced listening to all sides of a story before making judgments. In one corner of the hall, Kevin, now promoted to Community Outreach Coordinator, showed visitors the new computer system he had helped develop. It helped court officials better understand and accommodate various professional and emergency situations. Last week, Kevin shared proudly, "We had a surgeon who needed to park near the courthouse for an emergency consultation. Thanks to our new system, she got immediate clearance. No questions, no delays." Sarah, still working as the court clerk, but now training other courthouses in their new procedures, led a workshop on effective communication. "Remember," she told her group, "everyone who comes through those doors has a story. Our job is to listen." During the lunch break, Maya and Judge Barrett sat in the educational garden, which had become a popular spot for both courthouse visitors and local residents. "You know," Maya said, watching a group of students examining the marine life displays, "when I woke up that morning 6 months ago, I was worried about saving coral samples. I never imagined we'd end up saving something else too." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "A more just system. And it all started because I made a mistake and then learned from it." As the day drew to a close, a local news crew interviewed them both for a special report on the program's success. The reporter asked what message they wanted to share with other communities. "Change is possible," Maya answered, "when we're willing to look past our first impressions and really listen to each other." Judge Barrett added, "And justice works best when it comes with understanding." After the event, as the last students filed out with their marine science and justice workbooks, Maya found a letter left on her presentation table. It was from a young girl who wrote that she now wanted to become both a marine biologist and a judge. Maya shared the letter with Judge Barrett, both of them smiling at how their unexpected meeting had created ripples of change that would continue to spread, just like the healing patterns of a coral reef, touching lives and transforming communities far beyond the walls of one courthouse.